fills. They are some of the most overlooked parts of your sidetrance track, and that is because this is the part of the track where the kick and bass is not going to be playing. And generally speaking, most people care a lot more about the part where you're actually dancing than the part where you're not dancing. And in my opinion, that is a little bit of the wrong approach. Because when you do start to think about your fills, you can create cool stuff like this. Now, of course, there's a lot of sound design going on over here and a lot of cool things that are happening over here as well. But really what I want to focus on is the little fill in between. And to be honest, not just this fill over here, but many more fills in this production. Because in this production, I spend a lot of time worrying about the fills. And the real reason for that is when it comes to the flow of your track, it is in the fill where it actually adapts to the new segment. So you can imagine that over here, we have one segment. And then, of course, after this fill, we're going to have a different segment. You can see that we have more sequences coming in. You can see that we have some more drums coming in over here. There's some atmosphere and some vocal ideas as well. So this is definitely a new section of the track. And that is, of course, why this fill is over here, to indicate that that new section is about to happen. Now, I can imagine that there's a lot of different things that you can do. You can raise in energy, you can lower in energy, you can stay at the same energy if you want to. And in this case, the track is kind of high energy before the actual fill happens. And then it goes into something that I would classify as a little bit lower energy, even though there's like more drums and more sequences and stuff like that. Everything that is there is fairly sparse. Whereas over here we have this cool vocal that is rising up together with a lot of different risers over here. And you can hear that it nicely raises up into this portion over here, where we have one kick that then slowly morphs back into the next drop over here. So you can imagine that if you draw that as like a line of energy level, we have this rising energy level. We have these vocals and risers rising up. We have these drums coming in over time. Everything is indicating that the energy is rising up. And then we have this one kick that really just closes everything. And that is going to be the moment or indication that, oh wait, the energy level isn't actually continuously rising. We just have this little pause in here. And then it goes into the actual drop that is going to have, I would argue, a similar energy level to this part of the track over here. Of course, here we have a lot of risers and stuff like that. So here I would say that it's rising. And then here we have the little like actual pause that is the indication of something is about to happen. And now we go into the next drop. Now, in order to achieve that, you can imagine that we really don't want any other sounds happening over here. There are some sounds that are still playing, maybe some like small delay tails, I believe. There's like a little extra snippet of sound, I believe, that sometimes plays. But most of the sounds actually completely turn off. Now, the way that I achieve this stopping effect is actually fairly easy. Let's go into one of the sounds that is actually playing right before it, which is this vocal over here. You can hear it just completely cuts out. And the way that we're doing that is by taking the delay. And you can see we're automating it off. Any glitchy things that we're doing, we're making sure that it's automated off. I believe there may also be a reverb somewhere in here. If not, then we don't have to worry about that. But let's take this other sound, for example. Here we are doing a little bit more with the shifter and the spectral time here. So this actually has the issue that it can extend the sound into this part. So what you see that I do is I just have a utility that goes gain all the way down. And then, of course, any delays and reverbs are also cut off. And again, that is just immediately going to cut the sound right when that kick drum plays. And realistically, what I could do is just have a utility and then I don't have to automate stuff like the delay over here. But personally, I like to make sure that I also automate the delay itself so that I don't run into any issues. Like say that I do change my mind on this and for some reason I decide to turn this off. I still don't want the delay to actually come through here. So just cutting out the delay like this is a really nice way of keeping this part of the fill a little bit less occupied. And therefore we can do cool effects like we saw before. But this also just helps with the mixing in the sense that stuff with a lot of delay tails, if you have loads of different sounds like we can see in this production over here, at some point you sometimes just have to cut it out to make more space in the mix for other sounds. And this is really something that I started to do more and more in this production, as this production is a little bit more like dense than my other productions. So there's a lot of stuff happening in very short notice after each other. We have like glitchy things, for example, over here. And what you'll see that also over here, I'm using the volume control to really dial in the exact kind of sound that I want here. And in this case, you can see that I'm actually stacking up effects. So you can see another version of a volume modulation over here. And this is all happening on the synths and sequences group, because this is the first time that I'm actually using that group for actual processing and stuff like that, as opposed to just organization. And the reason for that is one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to glitch all of the sounds up together. And in a lot of fields, that is what is happening. You can see that we have some automations over here which determine when the output mix is turned up and therefore where the glitch is active. And you can imagine that dragging over this individual plugin onto all of the individual sounds that I want to glitch up and then making sure that they're applying the same glitch is a lot less quick than just doing it on the group. Now the cool thing that you'll see is that for a lot of the sounds, there's a lot of automations. Let's just look at all of the parameters that I'm automating over here. You can just see all of the red dots over here that are being automated. And if I actually go into the group and review all of them by holding Alt and clicking over here, you can see that there's a ton of different automations happening on this group alone. And as you can imagine, on the individual sounds that are actually part of this group, we also have a lot of automations. So one of the things that I want to highlight is how many different automations are actually used in order to determine the flow of your fill. So this fill is actually the introduction for this main ARP ID over here. And what I wanted this sound to do is I really wanted it to kind of come from far behind everything else. So this is the fill that I ended up with.
How did that make you feel?
You can really hear that it almost feels like the track is kind of slowing down here. It almost feels like it's going into a breakdown or something like that. And then all of a sudden we have this ARP coming in over the last part of the fill and really adding a little bit of extra energy to that before we go into another high energy part of the track. And there's several cool things that we're doing over here. First of all, there's this vocal over here.
What did that make you feel?
Of course, we have this cool delay effect on this, which is really just kind of filling up this space over here. But that means that there's a lot of stuff happening over here in this part of the fill and less stuff happening in the last part of the fill. Like this vocal, of course, really just takes the attention away from everything here.
What did that make you feel?
And you can see that this vocal is also lined up with a kick and bass and some drums happening over here still. I believe this is filtered. It is actually filtered in an interesting way. We also, of course, have some other drums in there. There's a little snare roll in here, which is sometimes cool. Again, what you'll notice is that I'm using fades to make the sound a little bit shorter so that we get a little bit of a tighter sound. I would almost explain it as I'm making space for the transients over here to get a little bit of extra punch out of that. In the sense that if I just have it bleeding into that by doing something like this, it's going to be a small difference because of course the sample naturally decays over here, but just getting a little bit more impact with a fade in front of it makes it so that it goes to silence before it actually plays the next sound, and therefore that next sound is going to have more punch because the dynamic range is going to be increased. There's other things as well, like this rattle roll thing that is really just used to introduce the fill. But you can see that a lot of these elements are just part of the first part of the fill. Yes, we do have some crashes over here, which are like pant crashes. But even that is just part of the first 2 beats of the second part of the fill. And really where I wanted this melody to kind of swinging at the last possible time is of course in the last part. So that will be the last 2 beats of the second bar of the fill. Keep in mind that the fill starts here so that we have a 2-bar fill over here, even though the kick and bass kind of continues. So it still looks like a 1-bar fill here. Anyway, going back to the point that I was making on the automations, you can therefore imagine that when it comes to creating a fill like this, it is really just stacking modulations on top of each other. So this whole idea of the melody kind of swinging in at the last possible time is basically a combination of how all of these automations over here are set up. A lot of this is in regard to how I'm using the delay here. You can imagine the delay is going up, up, up. It reaches 100% dry wet and then it goes down again. So therefore the main dry sound of the melody, which is a little bit louder and a little bit more focused, comes back in. And there's a lot more things that I'm doing on top of that. Of course, I don't want to sit here and spend an hour trying to explain exactly what I'm doing here. It's mainly about just the idea that I want to convey you. But for example, over here, we have another auto pan. So this is just one part of like the rising effect or whatever effect that you want to say that is happening inside of the fill. You can hear it just kind of sweeping open and coming out of nowhere. But of course, we also have all of these automations, which are just layered on top of that. And this is kind of like the main filtering. This is also where we get the kind of sweep up effect from towards the end here. So hopefully you can tell that it's this kind of collective of different ideas, different automations, different ways of processing the sound that really makes those sound interesting and that really makes these kind of fills work. Because when it comes to the automation for your main idea, the way that I like to think about it is that all of this stuff over here, all of the stuff that is happening on top of the kick and bass that is playing normally, takes about as much time as the stuff that is happening in the fill. And the reason for that is because the fill is tasked with like actually changing the energy level. You can imagine that the changes have to happen much faster and therefore they become much more complex. To give you a good example of that, we can see the difference between the frequency over here and over here. So you can imagine that there's this massive frequency sweep happening, which we can also see with the EQ over here. Of course, that is exactly what I wanted to have with this fill. But you can imagine that something like this, where the frequency is opening up, can also be applied to just your normal drop. It is just that usually for the drop, what tends to happen is that the frequency slowly opens up as the filter cutoff rises and rises. Something like an acid sound would be a good example of that. So you can see that these fills, they generally have ideas which are much shorter in time. That is partially, of course, to do with the way that the structure works, but also because of the way that we tend to flow with the energy here. And therefore, you'll have to take something like that into account in your actual fills. Now, if I scroll up a little bit, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of different small drum snippets over here. A lot of these are actually parts of fills as well. As we saw before, we had these snares and these crashes. But let's go to the next one and we will probably find some drum fills. I'm sure there's many more, so stuff like this over here. There's more stuff happening even over here. This is the fill that we saw before where we have that little pause there. By the way, somebody recently on my Patreon asked me what this suction sound is here. So this suction sound is nothing more than a kick that is reversed. And yes, it is as easy as reversing the kick drum. One of the things that I do like to take into account though is that I remove the transient. So if we look at the actual kick, like the click part of the kick is gone. We're just starting with a little bit of a lower frequency. And that is going to make it so that this click still is going to have a little bit of impact. If I take the whole click and I add it like this, it kind of goes as opposed to kind of going up and then still having a click and impact. Anyway, somebody did ask me that, but that is one of the other elements that I tend to use in the fill. The main thing that I want to show you is that there's just a lot of different elements that I like to use for this kind of stuff. And if I zoom out, you can see there's a whole bunch of different groups, a whole bunch of different ideas, a whole bunch of different combinations. Of course, we have this group over here, for example, that is just the drum fill, but then later on it gets played again with the two drum fills on top of each other. And of course, a whole bunch of the context is changed and therefore it's also going to be sounding differently and being perceived differently by the listener. But one of the things that I hear a lot in beginner productions is that they create something like a fill and then they tend to use that fill everywhere. If you go through this track, what you'll find is that there's a lot of similar ideas. There's a lot of similar, for example, kick patterns that I'm using in the fill. There's a lot of similar drum fills that I'm using all over the place. But the idea is never the same. There's never two instances in the track where the exact same sounds are playing in the exact same manner. Or three sounds that they used, for example, in the last fill are used again in a very clear way. Usually I either don't use those same sounds again, or I cover them up with some other sounds that make that part a little bit more interesting. Now, another thing that I should probably say is that there's kind of two types of fills happening over here. If we look just into the structure, you can see that I have some orange parts over here. These are the fills that I would say are like the main fills here. And you can see I even have some of the other smaller fills noted over here. So this is a big one, this is a big one, this is a big one. These are the ones that close out the section and close out an idea. So this one over here. I think later on I stopped indicating all of the fills in the structure, but you can see that we still have some left here. All of the fills that are like at the end of a section that finish the section off and allow a new idea to come in. Those are the fills that I've been talking about up until this point, where really the transition happens between elements. And that is generally speaking where you want to go crazy and give the listener a little bit more space in order for the fill to actually exist. So what you'll see is that they're usually at least a bar long, but sometimes also 2 bars. And in very rare cases, I have stuff like this, which is actually 4 bars long. But then there's also all of the other smaller fills that are sitting in between. We've already heard a few of them. For example, over here, you can see that I'm doing some stuff with the kick over here and over here. These are more like, I would say, complexities, which is something that I actually have done a video on before in regards to high tech. But of course, with this kind of sidetrends, you also want those kind of things happening. And probably a better example of that is stuff over here. So here you can see we have quite a bit of complexity happening. So if I just play this segment over here, you can see we basically have the big fill over here. So here you can see we actually let the kick and bass not play for 2 bars and let the listener rest a little bit with the dancing before they go back into the dancing. But with these complexities, you can see that they're happening pretty fast. So most of these are actually just half a bar or even smaller than that. I believe over here, you could almost say that this is a 1 bar fill here, this little idea. But even there, technically, the kick and bass is still playing for the first half of it. The main idea, of course, being that we have this little melody thing here. And that works really well with some of the tonal snares that I have in this project. So if we play both of them together. It kind of works in terms of the melody that they're playing together, I guess. But even here, the actual complexity, I would say, with the kick and bass that we're doing and really messing up the rhythm in a way, that's only happening in the second part, so in the last 2 beats. So therefore, I would say that with these complexities, they tend to be shorter and they're not necessarily there to, okay, remove the low frequencies, remove the danceability of the tracks, let something change, and then continue with the track. This is more about just keeping those parts of the track interesting and just having a small indication of, okay, we're here in structure, right? So here, the main complexities happen at 4 bars, 8 bars, and 12 bars. And then we have another small thing at 14 bars as well as 16 bars over here. So those are just indications of the actual structure of the track, of the actual divisions of this 16 bars over here. But again, the main change in idea is going to be happening in your bigger fills, which are going to be at the end of the sections. So that's going to be it. That is everything that I want to cover in this video. There's going to be a much bigger video on this particular track where I'm going to go through every cool thing that I'm doing to get this production where it is right now. But of course, I want to finish the production before making that video. So for that reason, I'm already working on some smaller content that I can get out of this project. Either way, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.